Welcome, classic rock fans, to a video about Rainbow, and not just Rainbow, the rainbow that really mattered. Ronnie James Dio, Ritchie Blackmore. Of course, Rainbow forms after Blackmore's dissatisfaction with the direction that Deep Purple were going in, decides to form a kind of a purple baiting hard rock fantasy band. There's no doubt that Rainbow developed into one of the most successful bands, hard rock bands of the 1970s. Elf themselves were doing okay for themselves. They'd supported Deep Purple, Uriah Heep, and even the Alice Cooper band. Ronnie James Dio's got one of the most recognisable voices in rock, and with Ritchie Blackmore he launches a whole new genre, the sort of neoclassical fantasy hard rock. Maybe launch is a strong word. I mean, you could almost make a point for arguing that Uriah Heep were there before them. It was certainly a far cry from what this band would become later on, as Blackmore wanted to become more of a pop star, I think, and certainly the band's ever-changing musical direction and personnel certainly began to alienate their fan base. And Rainbow was formed around Dio's band Elf. Of course, Elf had to dispense with their guitarist, but nevertheless, the bassist Craig Gruber, keyboard player Mickey Lee Soul, and drummer Gary Driscoll. That is before Blackmore, one by one, decides to sack them all. Nevertheless, the debut album was embraced, certainly by European audiences, as being something very, very special, especially the single Man on the Silver Mountain. So if I had to rank the Rainbow albums, the Dio-era albums, all three of them, which would I consider to be the best one? So number 3 is Long Live Rock and Roll. Many argue that this album was kind of a foreshadowing of what was to become for Rainbow. It featured bassist Bob Daisley, although I think I've read reports somewhere that it was actually Blackmore that played most of the bass on this album. The third album, of course, with Ronnie James Dio, it's an album that gets a lot of flack from fans for lacking the grander, more progressive aspects that we got with the Rising album. But as Martin Popoff writes, what Long Live Rock and Roll lacks in epicness, it more than makes up for in groove, strength and catchiness. But things were not looking good for this band at this juncture. Dio was tired of constantly operating in Blackmore's shadow. I get the impression working with Blackmore is only a very short-lived thing anyway, for as long as you can tolerate him. But Blackmore was so impressed with the success of the song Long Live Rock and Roll. As I said before, it starts to be a kind of a signpost as to where he wants to take the band. He wants to take the band away from those neoclassical gothic elements that was very much part of Dio's songwriting style, to a more transatlantic, poppier, hard rock feel. Nevertheless, although this album in general lacks the epicness of Rising, it does contain the Gates of Babylon, which is very much like its centrepiece, like its Stargazer. More like Kashmir, really, with its eastern feel to it. The song certainly has an Arabic flair with that synth start, instantly giving it a feeling of mystique and wonder. The sleeve wasn't without controversy either. The sleeve design was actually inspired by Aerosmith's Draw the Line, but without the comedic elements. It was more of a faithful sort of pencil drawing. But it's a photograph in the gatefold which showed an audience. Now, the audience shot was actually taken at a Rush gig, with it kind of de-rushed, really taking the Rush elements out of the photograph, but the audience shot was effectively at a Rush gig, which apparently really pissed off Geddy Lee. Other songs on this album that are rather interesting, you get the Lady of the Lake, which owes much to Zeppelin's The Wanton Song, I think, and LA Connection, which Daisley calls a bit like Rainbow trying to be Bad Company. Number 2 is Ritchie Blackmore's Rainbow from 1975, the debut album. During the recording of the Stormbringer record, Blackmore was growing increasingly dissatisfied with the band's direction, descending into what he felt was a kind of pseudo-soul music. So Ritchie Blackmore forms his band, apparently named after the infamous Rainbow Bar and Grill in LA. Then Blackmore would just keep with that sort of gothic, neoclassical conceit, fill his band with elves. Interestingly, Martin Popoff makes the point in his book about there being a correlation between the artwork of the Stormbringer album and the artwork of the first Rainbow record. Maybe a tenuous link, however. The gatefold, the label had to perform a bit of sleight of hand because the band had never performed live, so the live shots were from Blackmore playing with Deep Purple and some shots of Elf as well. There's no doubt the opening track on this album, Man on the Silver Mountain, is Rainbow's Smoke on the Water. It's got that big sluggish riff, which certainly puts it in that sort of company. Dio concurs, of course. Dio says, Man on the Silver Mountain had the same attitude as Smoke on the Water. It immediately connected Ritchie's past with our future. But it's a track that instantly establishes a kind of thematic motif for this band, that of a theme of medieval wizardry, dragons and rainbows. Many consider this to be heavy metal, but heavy metal with deeply classical overtones, historical and fantasy themes all thrown into the mix. Other records that might fit this narrative, as I've said before, would be Uriah Heep's Demons and Wizards, and maybe even Rush's Caress of Steel. Interestingly, Dio tells a fascinating story in his autobiography when Elf were supporting Purple. Apparently he was approached by John Lord, and John Lord said, quoting Dio now, John Lord pulled me aside and told me Ritchie was leaving the band and that if he asked me to sing with him on his new project, absolutely not to do it, under any circumstances. John looked at me sternly, which he was very capable of doing, and warned me that it would all end in tears. The first song that Dio and Blackmore wrote together was Catch the Rainbow, which Dio describes as a kind of medieval blues. Nevertheless, not everyone was on board with this new direction with this band. I think Rolling Stone described it as bored and lifeless. The album also contains music written by Blackmore with lyrics by Dio. Now, originally, I think that they had argued over the title. It was going to be called Ritchie Blackmore and Ronnie James Dio's Rainbow. Bit of a mouthful, of course, but nevertheless, Dio was certainly irked when it came out as Ritchie Blackmore's Rainbow. This album came out in August 75, and much to Blackmore's delight, actually performed better in the US charts than the Purple album, Come Taste the Band. But it certainly put down the blueprint for a wonderful, wonderful sound and vibe. Of course, with Rainbow Rising, it was like musical chairs. The whole lineup of the band had changed. Blackmore drafted in bassist Jimmy Benn, Tony Carey on keyboards, Jeff Beck, group drummer Cozy Powell. And of course it was this lineup that entered Musicland Studios in Munich to record their finest album, also their most progressive album. It was definitely a landmark album. In fact, Kerrang voted it the greatest heavy metal album, I think in a poll they did in 1981. Dio also said that I knew this would be one of the greatest records I'd ever sing on, although later on he was heard in an interview rather disparagingly describing some of this record as pretentious shit. But there's no doubt this is the band at the peak of their powers, really showing off those neoclassical metal compositions. It's the band at their most ambitious, with Dio's continuing fixation with fantasy and lyrical themes. And of course the album features the remarkable Stargazer. Now Dio said of Stargazer that it's written from the perspective of a slave in Egyptian times. He's serving the wizard who observes the skies and stars and becomes obsessed with the idea of flying. This kind of gothic fantasia is right up my street, to be honest with you. It sort of taps into the whole Icarus myth of the overreacher, but nevertheless it has a very dark, tragic elements. There's no doubt the music on this track is panoramic. In fact, Martin Popoff makes the link between this track and Led Zeppelin's Kashmir, which is something Blackmore has actually confirmed. Now, the cover for the Rising album was painted by Ken Kelly, who was also famous for painting the cover for the Kiss Destroyer album. I think he also did the Kiss Love Gun album as well. This album just has everything. It's the complete package, as far as I'm concerned. Although, as I've said before, Dio seemed to be quite disparaging about it later on. If I may quote from Dio, you kind of feel left out of the loop a little bit as a vocalist. So I took the whole album and say, well, I was on the first side and half of the second side, and not very much of the other part, so it seems to me that there were just better songs on the first album. Do you agree with Dio? Let me know in the comments below. Anyway, we've been watching a sort of a mini ranking of the Rainbow Dio albums. Let me know what your ranking would be. And other than that, stay well, healthy, but more importantly, keep listening.